environment. So welcome, Joe. It's great to have you with us, particularly in your new role today. And then Paul Blair. Paul is the Chief Executive of Infrastructure New Zealand, New Zealand's highly respected peak infrastructure body. Paul is responsible for the leadership of the organisation and is passionate about developing New Zealand's infrastructure into a leading thought leadership network of Aotearoa. Infrastructure New Zealand's vision is that all New Zealanders enjoy the benefits of world-class infrastructure, living more prosperous, environmentally sustainable, culturally and socially rich lives. Welcome, Paul. Andrew Eagles from the New Zealand Green Business Council. Andrew is a qualified economist with more than 14 years experience in the built environment. He joined the New Zealand Business Council in 2016 as their Chief Executive. And as many of us know and familiar with the Green Building Council's work, it's the country's leading not-for-profit in the sustainable built environment. As well as doing significant research, Green Building Council oversees the use of the Homestar and Green Star rating tools and is also starting to use neighbours more significantly. And finally, Ainsley, who you met at the start, Chief Executive of Infrastructure Council of Australia. Ainsley focuses on fostering partnerships that enable ISCA's purpose, which is to ensure all infrastructure delivers social, cultural, environmental and economic benefits. So let me now, welcome to you all. Let me now ask that first question, and I'll just encourage people to use the Q&A if they've got questions that come up during this time. So Joe, let me start with you. How do you see that we can combine the drivers of economic recovery and this lovely term that we're all using, shovel-ready projects, with our aspirations for a sustainable future for New Zealand, particularly in regard to climate change? What opportunities do you think might be associated with some of that?
Thanks, Kerry, and kia ora koutou. First, I want to start by acknowledging that this has been a hard time for many people in many sectors, and I really appreciate this opportunity to actually start to look to recovery and look to the future and start to see a way out of where we've been. In answer to your question, a month or so ago, the Commission wrote to the Minister of Climate Change, presenting 6 principles aimed at doing just what you asked, helping guide government decision making so that we get the investment needed to deliver an economic recovery, as well as the investment needed to keep New Zealand on track to our climate goals. The first principle is to consider how stimulus investments can deliver long-term climate benefits. Essentially, both the public and private sectors need to be running a climate lens over all investments, asking questions such as, do these investments make sense in a low emissions climate resilient world? Are they future-proofed? Or do they lock us into long-lived assets that take us down to a high emissions pathway, lock us into increased exposure to the impacts of climate change? So to do this, we need to go further than just factoring in the short-term ETS price into our investment analysis. So the ETS price alone will not be enough to get the change we need across the economy. There are more barriers to change than just simply around the price. And for example, a $25 carbon price only equates to an extra 6 cents per litre at the pump, which is not going to be enough to switch to an electric vehicle for a lot of people. In some areas, we'll need regulation and other mechanisms to help us get there. So what this means when making long-lived investments in things such as infrastructure, We need to be thinking about the long-term emissions prices that are going to be consistent with where we need to get to in the long term for our low emissions future, and factor these prices into the investment analysis. So doing so will result in sound long-term investment decisions, ensuring that they're being shaped so that they can actually succeed in a low emissions world, and putting a climate change lens over the stimulus will in the end lead to that more sustainable and stable economic recovery. Principle 2 is to bring forward climate change investments that need to happen anyway, that we know now will need to be happening over the next 10 years. Given we need to spend this money now, and we don't have the luxury of spending it twice, we need to aim for multiple wins. And if we can do this, we can reduce future costs while creating new jobs for today, reducing emissions and building an economy that can withstand the impacts of climate change in the future. So as a real world example, it's pretty clear that accelerating electrification using renewable generation is going to be a key strategy for moving us to a low emissions future. We know that around 20% of our total emissions come from transport, around 10% from process heat, and around 5% from electricity. Much of this can be electrified, reducing our emissions. But for this to happen, we will need the right infrastructure in place, including EV charging networks, new transmission lines and upgrades to local lines, a new wind, solar, geothermal, pumped hydro generation to meet the demand. These are the types of investments that can be brought forward. Our third principle is about preparing our workforce for the jobs of tomorrow. So new opportunities will emerge from the climate change transition, and we need a workforce that has the education and training to take advantage of these new jobs. We know that accelerating electrification will provide jobs and opportunities to upskill. We also know that our digital economy is likely to form more of New Zealand's future. Smart technology and the Internet of Things can increase efficiency and reduce emissions. The digital economy presents opportunities for building on our strengths in agriculture, tourism, and technology, and has a reputation for adapting quickly. Alongside equipping people with the skills needed for building houses and more infrastructure, we should be providing access to these 21st century skills. The fourth principle is really that the government needs to work in partnership across the board on this. So with iwi Māori, with the private sector, with the research community. The recovery plan needs to be shaped so it's consistent with the treaty, can leverage private sector action and finance, and work with the research community where we need new opportunities and tools to be built. The fifth principle is about maintaining the incentives to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. So we will still need a clear and credible signal for low emissions investments through the ETS, and this will remain key. Finally, the sixth principle, we need to change how we measure the economic recovery. This means alongside the traditional economic indicators, we need the measures of well-being. We'll need this full suite to be able to see whether New Zealand is recovering and progressing to a future that is inclusive, prosperous, sustainable, low emissions, and climate resilient. So to wrap up, this is a time of huge uncertainty, but it is one also of opportunity. The economic stimulus the government has underway is the biggest of our lifetimes. We all that we've ever seen. If we can make those smart decisions and low emissions practices, technologies and infrastructure, we have the opportunity to rebuild the economy, create jobs, and make sure people are better off for both now and in the future. And I'll just briefly leave you with a short synopsis of what the role of the Climate Change Commission is in all of this. So we are an independent organisation set up by the government to provide independent, evidence-based advice on the strategies and actions that New Zealand needs to take in order to achieve our goals on climate change. Our advice will help create the systems change needed for a low emissions and climate resilient future. We're here to help New Zealand avoid costly mistakes through this evidence-based advice. The Commission's role is to look across systems and highlight strategies and pathways for different layers of government and the private sector. And our independence is really important here because it means that we are in a position where we can question investment decisions, put our hands up when we think policy is heading in the wrong direction, and hold the government to account. New Zealand has reached the point where climate change needs to be the focus of our future investments. I think this is the time to take advantage of the opportunity. Thanks, Kerry.
Great, thanks, Jo. It's fantastic to hear from you about the work of the Commission and also the sharing your thoughts around those principles. I think it's really good scene setting. So, Andrew, moving on to you. We often talk about resilience, particularly in the infrastructure sector, as kind of a more understandable, maybe practical ambition than the more expansive concepts of sustainability, longer term concepts of sustainability. What do you think is needed to ensure that as we're rebounding in this economy, that we're building resilient infrastructure that does also contribute to more sustainable and just communities?
Thanks so much. It's great to be here speaking with these other great panelists. And just to make one observation from the start, for me, when Jo is showing up, and it's great to be on the panel with you, so excited to have the Climate Change Commission established. She's kind of got a glow about her. It's as if an angel or something is coming from on high to help us. And I do actually think there's a bit of an indication that having the Commission is already making people sit up and think. And already in New Zealand, Rod Carr's really insightful thoughts on Radio New Zealand, even today, pointing to the dramatic change that is needed, have been powerful in starting to signal change. And that's even before we start setting those carbon budgets. So tremendous to have Jo hovering over us, heading us in the right direction. I think that to come to the point, the question, resilience, I really like the phrase because it captures far more about risk, and it's a wider consideration of the things we need to take into account. And I think that there's huge potential in the infrastructure projects of Aotearoa to be doing far more. Projects such as the City Rail Link, I've had a look at and seen the immense improvements they've made to waste diverted from landfill, education of the supply chain, a consideration of a whole range of resilience for the city. And I think that with only 5 projects in New Zealand, but this $15 billion investment coming, that there's real opportunity to step up. And I know that's something that Paul's really excited about as well. I think also that we need to think about resilience quite broadly, and that's why I like the term. Part of what the Prime Minister and others have as a vision is a just transition. And this is really, really important politically. The challenge we're going to face in sustainability is not technically how to do this. It's to take parts of New Zealand with us. And we are seeing a genuine pulling away of jobs and opportunities. So I'm from Taranaki, just to put that out there, the best province in Aotearoa. But they, in a number of decades, won't be able to extract gas. And that's the right thing to do. But globally, we've seen, I was in the UK, the north of England suffered severely from the loss of mining and other job opportunities, and that caused a backlash. Now, they backlashed at the wrong thing. They backlashed at the EU, who were supporting them, creating jobs, and the biggest market in the world. But that caused quite a bit of instability for their country, and it's the same in the US. And I think that one of the things I like about ISCA and what they provide, and the potential of this, the $15 billion being put into infrastructure, is the potential to be training up the workforce that we need of the future. And that's because we are just scratching the surface of what we need to achieve. You know, we need to be looking at concrete and steel, which is going to be exceptionally lower in embodied carbon in a very short number of decades. We need to have people who are thinking about surface water runoff to exceptionally higher standards where we are. Heritage, education through the supply chain, clean mobility, these sorts of things are going to be transformational. And what the IS ratings do is give us an indication of how to measure those and to start to make change. And the thing that I'm really excited by is what we see at the Green Building Council is where you get a project, we get a flutter of other projects wanting to learn from that and take it up and be measurable and take that further. So, you know, I agree with the comments from the participants where they're in that middle kind of ranking. But what we need to be doing is sharing out the knowledge from the projects where we get these IS ratings on these infrastructure projects so that we mainstream this. It is, I should say, that the New Zealand Green Building Council and our members are exceptionally concerned that there has not yet been an indication from Minister Jones or indeed others about the tools that will be used. There's concern that tools may be used that the sector doesn't understand, and there's also been no indication of transparent analysis of the sustainability of these projects yet. And I think that if people here are interested in that, that now is the time to push for this and to really drive change. Kia ora, thanks. I look forward to the discussion, the rest of the discussion.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Yeah, many things for us all to be thinking about there, and just kind of, you know, it's really good to be exercising the brain and to start absorb and think about some of these bigger picture questions. Paul, going to move on to you now. We've talked quite a bit about the investment opportunities around infrastructure here in Aotearoa. And I understand the investment or infrastructure reference group has begun to consider the relative merits of many of these shovel-ready proposals. How exactly do you see the balance between the economic recovery and the longer-term support for the four well-beings and the government's commitment to broader outcomes playing out here in New Zealand?
Well, thanks, Kerry. It's the magic question, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
$136 billion worth of ask and $3 billion of give. So our understanding is that in a couple of weeks' time, maybe it'll be 3 weeks' time, that we'll understand what those shovel-ready projects are. I particularly like the term that someone used out there in the Twitter sphere of shovel-worthy, and I think that's a much better description, actually, which fits with our view that infrastructure is really just a tool. Though there are, I'm an ex-banker, but there are many engineers that love to build things. Really, infrastructure should only be built for people and for people's outcomes for those four well-beings. We're actually at a really interesting pivot point for me. I'm a bit of an optimist, but we're at a pivot point where, you know, we have our finance minister going into the budget saying phrases such as, if your house burned down, you wouldn't necessarily build it back in the same way, you'd build it back better. I think it's for us actually to define what better looks like. The wellbeing framework is there, but I would say that New Zealand broadly is still at the stage where we focus almost exclusively on the economic, and the other well-beings are either nice to haves or they're tick boxes in a tender document. The opportunity for us really is we've been pushing with our guidelines, and I really support what Jo has talked about with her guidelines. I think there's a lot of overlap with what we're talking about as well. Things such as social procurement, so that the benefits of infrastructure flow down and through. So that these 10, 20, 50-year assets continue to be sustainable in their outputs for people. So look, I think the shovel-ready projects thing of $3 billion, again, compared to $136 billion, just shows that there's an enormous need for investment here. I think that the role of the government is to set direction, but then remove those barriers to actually getting that investment happening from the whole sector, including the private sector and local government, has been a bit left out to date, I think, in this process. So look, for me, it's a huge opportunity. I'll just make a final plug that I think it's about the vision for New Zealand. So we're working with the Sustainable Business Council, a number of other partners, including Internet New Zealand, MB Ministry for the Environment. Joe will be a speaker for us as well, but we've got a thing called Vision Week between the 8th and the 12th of June at visionweek.co.nz. We're going to have a bunch of speakers that are going to poke and prod about what the sustainable long-term vision for New Zealand is. And I'd expect things that we're pushing here today in terms of this thought leadership are going to be the things that we need to push in order that we get a vision, but importantly, so that we end up with a national plan for New Zealand and for our future prosperity across all well-beings. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Paul. It's great to be thinking in terms of thought leadership vision, as we are in this moment, I think, of opportunity to influence, and it's going to be short-lived, I think, that window. So the work that we're talking about here today, and that you are going to be advancing as well in June, is really important work to be doing. Ainsley, from a strategic infrastructure perspective, choices are often made with future trends in mind: population growth, urbanisation, and increasingly climate risk. With record amounts of domestic infrastructure spent here in Aotearoa, totalling over 15 billion, can you see how these new shovel-ready projects can be accelerated to lay the foundation towards greater sustainability? Acceleration is a key word, but how do we accelerate this very important aspect?
Thanks, Kerry. Well, I think the importance is actually being bold and unapologetic. It's not just possible, it's going to be absolutely essential to promote infrastructure, because what we choose to build today, like Joe said, is going to be with us for the next 50 and 100 years. Infrastructure is a great tool, as Paul was mentioning. It is a productivity multiplier, and it's going to play a central role in New Zealand's economic rebuild. The Green Building Council and ESCA are actually completely aligned on this. All rebuild investment must deliver broader outcomes through procurement. This clearly supports government's 5 priorities for wellbeing, and it reinforces the procurement rules. So Andrew and I are together advocating that the practical and rapid accelerated way to deliver social, cultural, economic and environmental outcomes is by committing to best practice by adopting recognised standards to measure and achieve sustainable outcomes. We know that there are going to be 3 horizons of projects to consider. Those that are underway and that have been impacted by the alert levels, the shovel ready in 6 months, and then the shovel ready in 12 months, but all those to follow after that. So for those projects already committed to sustainability and underway, we know that your initiatives and your approaches have been impacted. So to help navigate, reward and recognise what you've done and your agility during this difficult time, we've released a ratings disruption plan to help guide you through, but also to recognise everything that you've done to honour sustainability through this time. So that's on our website. Get in touch with your EYES project manager. For those projects on the 6-month horizon that have been planned and designed to deliver broader outcomes, it's simple. Set a contractual target that requires you to get a sustainability rating. And if they've not been planned and designed to be sustainable, are they shovel worthy? And then for the 12 months and beyond, because I think that it's important that it's not just something that's short term, this is an opportunity to change behaviours. Let's not have any regrets. Set the policy default to sustainable. And ratings will enable these projects to be able to communicate credible data about the benefits being delivered for business, communities, and the workforce. And not just in the short term, but for the long term. Now, most of the folks that are joining us today will know that there is a lot of misinformation out there about the fact that sustainability adds cost with little value. However, our independently reviewed research into the return on investment on the rating scheme finds that projects under the ICE rating scheme will deliver up to $2.40 for every dollar of cost invested. So that makes the business case clear as to why sustainability, productivity, and profitability are not mutually exclusive. So why should the benefits only be limited to major projects? The study also found that if the uptake of standards like IS were doubled, the net benefits would soar to $90 million. So all infrastructure, urban, regional, large, small, new and aging, can deliver more for our communities, like Paul was suggesting. And with the pipeline of large and small maintenance contracts being fast-tracked, now is the time. So from ISCA's perspective, we're looking to scale some of our tools to deliver more sustainable, resilient and economically productive infrastructure. Part of our response to COVID has been to pivot our product development work plan. We're accelerating the development of IS Lite for projects greater than around 5 million, with a capex at the top end of 50 million, so that central and local government are able to measure and achieve best practice sustainability performance in an accessible, cost-efficient and appropriately scaled way. So if you want to help accelerate that development plan, please get in touch. But now is the time to be bold and unapologetic.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ainsley. I just want to open up the Q&A. Well, it's been open, but it's been very quiet. So I'd encourage all of you who are out there in your various locations to get your questions ready and to be putting those into the system so that we can continue this conversation with your input with our panelists. But I'm going to, while we're waiting for those to come up, Paul's going to talk to us about the construction accord and ratings framework and the transformation plan. It'd be great to hear about that as well, just building on what Ainsley's just had to say. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. I think a common theme is what you measure gets managed, I suppose. So the construction sector accord was set up before COVID, and it's a public-private partnership. Effectively, it's got 7 different ministers in it. And importantly, it covers the more traditional horizontal infrastructure, the vertical builds, and also the residential builds. So around about 40 billion per annum. So again, I just encourage the folk on the call and ISCA and others that I know that they're looking at things like Green Building Council standards. They're looking at the ISCA framework, looking at things like Project 13, which is the UK approach. But there's very much an opportunity there if we think of that wider system, of that $40 billion construction sector, to use frameworks. The other discussion there is the need for speed. So rapid deployment models have been a bit of a discussion. On the Infrastructure New Zealand website, there's some webinars that you can have a look at where we've discussed those rapid deployment models that we've used after past disasters like SCIRT in Christchurch or NICTA, which is the response to Kaikoura. And they were multi-award-winning approaches, and they did take a more holistic approach. They weren't ISCA rated, I don't believe, but they really did involve the community. They did take a longer-term approach, and they managed to do that with speed. But I think the key there is that they weren't necessarily projects, they were programs of work. And with a program of work, I know we're moving towards ISCA Lite and other things, but with programs of work, we can really generally get a major impact across the sectors. So just a thought that this is what we've been advocating for, is that if we went anywhere near $136 billion worth of shovel-ready projects, I think we'd have an enormous mess. But if we had a series of programs about our water sector or about our urban transport sector or about our housing sector, for example, then that's where we can put frameworks across that lift the performance of the whole sector. Thanks.
Brilliant, thanks, Paul. We're just going to quickly run our next poll question, and then we've got a couple of questions coming in from the floor, so we'll pick up on those. So Carlos, if you could put up our poll question number 2, thanks. So for all of you out there, and people are being a bit quiet, but this is an opportunity to participate, all 50 or more of you, how would you rate the readiness of the infrastructure sector to respond to and address climate change risks? High, a well-educated sector, good knowledge, etc., recognises their role. Medium, understand the importance, some capability, and low, understand the likely impacts but don't really understand the sector's role. That's great. Carlos, I'll get you to show us the results on that one. Okay, so that's a really interesting result coming through, a sort of medium to low, and a little different actually, my recollection of a similar poll that was run with an Australian audience. So I think that certainly the work that's been done on the National Climate Change Risk Assessment is an important piece of work, and bringing that out to the sector and getting the sector involved in their understanding their response to that, I think, is really key. So let's now move on to a couple of questions from the attendees. So Paul, tools like tools, software, and LCA type assessments, do you have a sort of sense of which tools you might direct projects or sustainability projects in the direction of using? I guess
I wouldn't get a vote back if I didn't say use this.
No, I know.
So look, I think
No pressure, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Kerry, feel free to mute him if he's going off message.
Didn't I say green homes and building council stuff in there? Look, I think that's a great start. Any framework that's got backing and evidence base behind it is going to be a great start. So we ran a webinar the other day on a digital twin, and I think that's another pathway along the line there to unlock huge amounts of data that we've got that are sitting in silos that is not connected. I think we started this with saying we're part of a system, and whether it's a project or a program of work in the infrastructure space, that's a system, and we need to make sure we've gathered all of that data together in order to manage it well. So yeah, I'd start with ISCA, and I'm sure that the Kerry or Ainsley or the team can help you out with that.
Brilliant, thanks so much. And of course, in the building space, Andrew and his team do such a great job with the Green Building Council tools. Let's now move on. We've got a question on buy-in at a government level, and maybe Joe, I'll start off with you, and others could join this question, but what buy-in are you getting at a government level around, I guess, around the take-up and integration of sustainability? This person had attended a Green Party session yesterday and really felt that we weren't going kind of past some very rudimentary environmental impact responses in terms of these next projects. So Joe.
Yep, sure. Thanks, Kerry. Well, I mean, the time will be the proof on this one. We got initially a good response to the principles when we wrote to our Minister and the Minister of Finance on those, and we were pleased with the willingness they showed to pick those up. We've since the budget's come out. There's been some positive parts to the budget, but it does not go far enough yet. It hasn't got the bold, transformative kind of action that we would want to see in it yet. The detail, the decisions that are yet to come are going to be crucial for whether we actually end up with the transformational change that we have the opportunity to take. I would agree with that. The opportunity to influence is now, because we're not going to be able to spend this money later. So we've got to be bold and make those the right decisions.
Great, thanks, Joe. We've got a great question here about the temporary suspension of the RMA. And maybe Paul, I might direct it to you in the first instance. This has come up on the chat, so just a reminder to people to use the Q&A process as well, but let me read it out. With the temporary suspension of the RMA and its environmental safeguards, what role do you see for ISCA? And actually, I might direct it to you first, Ainsley, and then others could come up to this or respond to it. What role do you see for ISCA and IS accreditation to fill the gap?
Right, and I might ask Andrew to step in as well, because I think it's important to recognise that there are different tools for both economic infrastructure and social infrastructure. I think that if you do have a framework, as Paul was saying, what's important is that you measure what matters, and what you measure gets managed. So while there is a temporary suspension, having frameworks that identify what business as usual is and what the possible opportunities are for going beyond compliance will provide some level of safeguard so that we do continue to deliver best practice rather than seeing this as an opportunity to bend the rules.
Andrew, would you like to add to that?
Well, I mean, just to say, I think Ainsley's making some great, really eloquent points, and I really like the quote I'm going to take away thus far is, if it's not sustainable, is it shovel-ready? And I am actually pretty deeply concerned at the moment with that lack of mention of carbon, the dramatic rise we've seen in carbon emissions from infrastructure in the last decade, and this further point, which I'm really glad has been brought up. So we're looking at not just a temporary suspension of the RMA, but the implications with that are also that the public has less insight and input to that. So what we're facing is, with some of the largest infrastructure investment that we've seen for some time, basically officials taking a view on what's sustainable and what isn't, that's shovel ready. And then further with the RMA, the temporary suspension of elements of that, also again, what we're being told is officials will consider what is or is not sustainable and less transparency. So I think those things are actually pretty frightening. The tools that ISCA have and we have, and indeed others have, such as Living Building Challenge and Passive House, have spent over a decade being developed by some of the leading thinkers. They prove things at the built stage, and really importantly, the sector understands them, the engineering consultants, the architects and others, and the private sector are doing this. Australia, you have over 110 projects completed. The Aussies are beating us. And they're established frameworks, and it is deeply concerning that we're not seeing that yet. And I think that there are going to be severe implications if we don't see a real stepping up. And worth noting that this is just the start. We're not even measuring embodied carbon in these projects yet. We have no idea of the embodied carbon impacts of some of these projects. Thanks.
Great. I've got one last question, which is we're going to need some pithy responses to, given our timing, but I think it's a really good question to ask. Thanks from who put that forward. Do the panel consider that the commissioning agencies are building sustainable thinking into the selection or scoping of projects? So is it the right project? Does it contribute to a low carbon future? If they're not doing that, what do you think they can be doing? So let me kick off on that with you, Paul, and we'll just get everybody from the panel to give a final comment on that question.
I'll be really quick. I think that we've got to keep in perspective that the shovel-ready projects have come together in about 2 to 3 weeks. And so our advice is that this is about low complexity, many jobs, initiatives that are at least as much about protecting people's livelihoods and the well-being that comes through that as achieving all the other things. And so that's not what we want to see. But what I'm pleased to see is that of the $50 billion envelope, actually, that we're not spending the majority of it on the here and the now. What we are doing is we're holding back a $20 billion bazooka plus some unspent money from previous programs. And I think the opportunity for us is to reimagine that future, because that is where we were going to gain the real ability. So if we're doing low tech, planting of trees and riparian water work stuff, if we're doing, sort of low tech stuff that employs lots of people but is not going to do huge damage to the environment, isn't going to transform, while we buy enough time for the 2 to 3 months to make these transformational type investments, I think that's actually a pretty good balance. We've got to remember just how much stress people have been under coming to this. So I think we must be realistic. And the point now is to make sure that our thinking about what matters most around productivity, sustainability, and those other things, equality of opportunity, gets embedded in the frameworks for how we reimagine New Zealand, not necessarily right here, right now.
Kia ora, thanks, Paul. Jo, let me hand to you.
Yeah, well, I agree with Paul. I mean, essentially, the infrastructure that we need to be building is key to be able to unlock our transformation, our climate change transformation. The technologies for decarbonising our energy and transport sector pretty much almost all exist today, but we need that infrastructure. So there is an opportunity here with the additional funding that, as long as the government makes good and private sector make the smart decisions, we can unlock the transformational investments.
Andrew.
So I'll be really brief and just say flat out that no, it's not happening. You just need to look at the numbers. How many infrastructure projects have we had? And we've only done 5 to IS standards. How many departments are actually building to Green Star, our standard for buildings? They aren't. Apart from Ministry of Health directing district health boards to build to Green Star, all of the other agencies that are meant to be signed up to the SDGs and the Treasury's Living Standards Framework are not. They have no guidance saying they are aiming for zero carbon. They have no waste reduction guidelines, and they are not independently measuring. So to put on the smiley face, there's huge opportunity to improve, and I really do think government can help shift the dial. They can walk the talk and do far more in this space. Indeed, the private sector is leading in this arena, and government needs to step up if they want to see change.
Great. Ainsley, just one quick comment from you.
What steps should we be taking? It's simple. Tie the funding to wider benefits and outcomes.
Brilliant. So we're going to do one last poll, and there are a couple of questions we missed. Unfortunately, everyone sort of got a head of speed as we came towards the end, but we will capture those and make sure that we build them into the mix as we move to the next panels coming up in the next couple of weeks. But our last poll, thanks, Carlos, which is pertinent to some of the conversations that we've been having here today. And just I'd encourage all 46 of you to vote. We've had a low voter turnout in a couple of the other polls, so please do take this opportunity to vote and share your thoughts with us as a way of summarising the outputs from today as well. Thanks, Carlos. Can we see where we got on this one? Oh, well, there we go. There we go. Andrew's got your vote as well. So it's just been fantastic to, really kind of get a focus around the questions that we have looked at today. Our panelists have, I think, inspired us in terms of some key principles, vision, but also some of the challenges to really ask us to not sit back during this time. This is a time for stepping forward, for being bold, both in your own environments and in the environments where you have influence, supporting those who are taking a lead, really kind of asking some of those hard questions. So thanks for all the participants who have been here. Thank you to our panelists for really bringing some great thought into the mix for us as we start emerging very slowly, albeit slowly, from the challenges of the past months, and also the challenges that lie ahead. I think it's been great to have that acknowledged by everybody as well. Let me at this point hand over to Patrick. Patrick is the Chief Operating Officer for ISCA.
Thanks, Kerry. Just to build on Kerry's thanks to our panelists and also to you, Kerry, for moderating today with such finesse. Another shout out to our sponsors, CRL, Mott McDonald and Certex for their support during these tough times. And finally, to all of you out there, thank you for participating. But also, if you would like to hear more and get involved, next Wednesday on the 27th at 10 a.m, we have a panel on social sustainability, procurement, inclusion and diversity. And then the following week, a panel on net zero. And then finally, for those of you who are practitioners or looking to become practitioners, we have a panel with our verifiers to talk through the tips and tricks on how to improve the rating or how to improve sustainability on your projects. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you further into the future.
Thanks, everyone.
Kia ora, everybody. Ka kite.
Ka kite anō.
Good day.